we are going to talk about open source and AI. But let's start with introducing Jim here. So how many people here know about Linux, this operating system?
Yeah, I figured in this crowd.
Okay, how many people know the name of the person who invented Linux? That's it? Okay, so Linus Torvalds invented Linux. And how many people know who's the boss of Linus Torvalds? That's this person right here.
Yeah, that is true. Yes.
Jim Zemlin. So Jim is the executive director of the Linux Foundation. It formed around Linux, I guess, when it started out.
Yep.
But now there are more projects inside LF than I can count. He's also very, very busy with the startup community. He advises a ton of startups because, as we all know here, open source is not just about public good. It's also about the core for a lot of startups that form in Silicon Valley and around the world. So he's advising a lot of startups too. And I'm going to read this, Jim, because I did not know this. But you are on the boards of the Global Economic Symposium,
Yeah.
Open Source for America, and the Chinese Open Source Promotion Union.
Yeah, Kopu.
I did not know all of
That's
these
right.
things. So welcome, Jim. I need to start with one complaint.
Uh-oh.
We had decided that this was the attire, the uniform,
The leather jacket.
the leather jacket to be in this show.
Yeah.
And what do?
First of all, this is in a fine Italian fabric. Second of all, I never caught on to the hoodie thing with Zuckerberg, and I'm not doing the leather jacket thing with Jensen.
So I'm the sucker and you're not?
Well, I just want to put it out there.
All right. So I've known you for, 15 plus years now?
Yeah, long time.
So we started doing Open Daylight together, and this is the time when networking was going through this massive change from hardware systems to software-defined networking. And this was in 2010, 2011, something
Yeah.
like that. And since then, I've known Jim. We worked together on CNCF, OpenSSF, what became of Open Daylight, I guess, LFN, and
Yeah.
LF Edge,
Yeah.
LF Data and AI. There's so many projects.
Yeah.
If I take you back on a journey to Jim Zemlin of 2005,
Yeah.
20 years ago,
Yeah.
to Jim Zemlin of today, what has surprised you of that
Yeah.
open source journey, and what are the insights that you've gathered?
Yeah, so if I go back to 2005, I think Linux was already becoming a thing or had become a thing, but my job was really to help Linux become the dominant form of computing. And I sort of found this job almost on a lark, but became really inspired by the community. But always thought like, okay, I'm gonna go and work at this nonprofit foundation, and then after that I'm gonna go do another startup. And I had done a couple of startups prior to coming to this company. And I remember back in 2005, I met my now wife, blind date. She went to Harvard Business School. She's a technology executive, and she asked me what I did for a living, and I said, well, I work at this nonprofit, and we give away software for free. It's open source. And the look of disappointment was like palpable. She's glancing at her watch. But 20 years later, we're still married. And what surprised me is what I thought would be this thing where we were trying to create Linux as a competitor to sort of get rid of the Unix market share. So we always thought like my job is create the perception of a two-horse race against Microsoft, so that people would think, well, Unix isn't a thing anymore. It's really going to be this Linux versus a Windows thing, and that would create momentum around Linux, and people would migrate all of their Unix workloads to Linux, which happened. What I didn't think would happen would be that if you look today across all forms of computing, embedded systems, networking, telecommunications, enterprise server technology, mobile devices with Android, automotive systems, Linux is like 90% market share. I never thought it would get that big. Really the only place where Linux doesn't dominate is on the traditional PC desktop at this point. And so I never really thought it would get that big. And then I never thought that open source would become this ubiquitous fundamental building block of tech. And so it's been a super fun journey in that sense.
Oh, this is amazing. And the fact that you bring up this whole Solaris and Unix and Windows and the move to Linux, we are at a similar inflection point today in AI.
Yeah.
One of the jokes I have running is if you say the word agents 3 times, agent, 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 a venture capitalist will appear behind you
I love that.
with a $100 term sheet, a $100 million term sheet,
Really?
rather $100 billion.
I hear you can convert a nonprofit to a for-profit, and so maybe I should start saying that.
So the narrative in AI is being driven by these really large, well-funded corporations.
Yeah.
It's difficult to call them startups. But they're driving the narrative. Where does open source stand in this, right? I mean, how do you compete against all of these folks who are so well-funded, who are driving the foundation frontier?
Yeah.
How does open source compete, or does it?
Well, I think, one, I think at the frontier model layer, there's a lot of open source code that makes that possible, right? Like generative AI wouldn't be a thing if not for open source technology, things like PyTorch and all of the tools that are used to pre-train and to build these models. All of that is really open source. Like the Linux Foundation is holding just over in Moscone West right now our PyTorch conference, where you're seeing projects that we host, like VLLM. Ray just became a Linux Foundation project.
Congrats.
All of that runs on Kubernetes. All of that runs on Linux. So I think that's everything outside of the frontier models themselves actually is open source when you really think about it. I think that the hard thing about open source being able to compete at the frontier large language model level, and I think Bill Gurley puts this the best, he calls it the sport of kings. And the reason it's the sport of kings is there are 2 things that make it really inaccessible to all but a very small number of organizations in the world, which is access to very, very large scale data sets, which I had hoped would get better and more open. It's actually the reverse is happening. Cloudflare is now making it harder to crawl. Anthropic set the floor on high-quality publisher data with their $1.5 billion settlement with the publishers in their class action suit. I actually wrote a book with some co-authors, so I get, I think, half of $5,000 split between 12 authors, so I'm very happy with that. So that's sort of setting a really high capital bar on data access, and then obviously compute is insane in terms of the billions of dollars of investment that it takes to train these models. And so I think there, open source has a much tougher road to haul. I do think there's some hope in 2 ways. One, I think in China you're seeing amazing activity in the opening of models like DeepSeek and Qwen. I hope to see another US model, like either a new version of Llama or another large model in the US come out in the open weight model. And then for every action where there's this incredible barrier and cost to doing something, people get pretty creative. And so maybe, these huge LLMs aren't the answer. We can kind of philosophically talk about, are people going to come up with more clever ways to, solve similar problems through a different modality than just, these large language models. But I think that's the biggest area where it's difficult for open source, is the data access and the capital access and GPUs.
But it's not all about foundation models. Even if we stick to foundation models, the one thing that open source does really well is it puts pressure on additional value add that you as a vendor provide. So you can start with open source. So the DeepSeeks of the world or the Qwens of the world have set a bar. And if you want to be a for-profit company with a closed source model, you need to be constantly pushing that bar higher. So from that perspective, I think open source is always or constantly pushing that bar
Yeah.
for the closed source vendors to compete against.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is more from an end user perspective in terms of where cost gets allocated in a stack for what everybody actually wants out of AI technology, which is an application, right? Some useful agent, some solution that will make their lives better at the end of the day. That's really at the application layer. Everything underneath that really becomes a cost. And what open source is very, very good at is lowering the cost of everything below the application layer so that the real value add can come at the layer where people actually need it. And this is just in traditional software development shown itself to be true over and over again. 90% of the code in any modern technology product or service, deterministic system, is open source. Like it's, a bunch of dependencies that you put together, and like you focus 10% of your software development time on the stuff that actually matters to your customer in a marketplace that you know. And so I think we'll end up seeing the same thing in AI over time.
And like you said earlier, I mean, it's not just the models that people are after. And so if you think about open source and AI, foundation models is one thing. There's a lot of open source in small language models and small models in general, but it's also the tooling. And you need to do something with the models, and you need to build the models somehow. So the tooling that you talked about earlier, PyTorch and Ray and these other projects, help you build and train these models.
Yep.
But also, we have a favorite here in this crowd, which is agency.
Yep.
And when you take a model and you want to do something with it, one of the things that people are trying to do with it is build agents, which are autonomous in nature. And each agent is not going to be sufficient on its own. So you're going to pull together a swarm of agents or a society of agents, a team of agents together to solve for a business problem.
Yeah.
And so when you try to do that, you go back to your infrastructure problem, because it's not just the foundation model, but it's everything else, the scaffolding around it, that becomes truly important.
Yeah, and I think we saw this in the cloud native transition from sort of virtual machines to containerization, where I don't know if you were around when Amazon had dominated cloud computing with virtual machines. And the reason why cloud native and containerization became popular is Google in 2014, I think it was, came to the Linux Foundation and said, we want to enter the cloud computing space, but we don't run virtual machines at Google at all. We use this system called Borg, and we use containers to deploy and scale all our infrastructure. And by the way, we think it's a really better technology than virtual machine infrastructure. And what we want to do is we're going to open source that technology. We'll call it Kubernetes. And we want the Linux Foundation to get everybody to adopt this new way of building and managing cloud applications. And that sort of started a little bit more slowly than I think people imagined, because at that point, getting Kubernetes out into the open, getting people to work on it, but also getting people to build all the adjacent technology that you need to deploy it effectively and monitor and really adopt the entire cloud native ethos, that took a long time. And I think we're in a similar situation now with agent technology, where people get it, like, hey, this is a better thing, this is something that's going to be incredible and impactful, but they haven't quite built out the entire ecosystem to get us to that sort of last mile of effective deployment.
So I'll ask you the favorite question, which is, do we need yet another protocol, or are we saturated with protocols? Or is that the only piece of infrastructure that you need? Or is there a lot more that is needed to build out multi-agent applications?
Well, I think agency paints a very broad vision of a lot of different components that you need beyond just the protocol. Like the protocol itself, like it's important, but protocol's protocol, right? I think we're still in a period where people are trying to iron out the major protocols around, agent-to-agent technology, around, I think MCP has, sort of for sure become the leading technology in that area. But, you'll need discoverability and registries and all sorts of adjacent technology that is being worked on, but could be better worked on collaboratively and could accelerate the building of the entire marketplace if we saw more collaboration. I think in the next 6 months, you're going to start seeing the industry start to come to consensus around these building blocks. I think you'll see major industry players start to collaborate more on pre-competitive agentic componentry and tooling in order to accelerate the entire marketplace. That's going to be great for startups. That's going to be great for organizations that want to adopt agent technology. I think it'll happen pretty darn fast, but we're definitely not there quite yet.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the CNCF ecosystem because, like you said, it started out with just Kubernetes, which is the core. But now if you look at the landscape, the CNCF landscape, I think there are 300 or so projects in the CNCF landscape, and each one of them, or most of them, are backed by either or are supported by either startups or large vendors out there who are trying to solve this bigger problem of an ecosystem around containers to make actual workloads work in enterprise-grade situations. And I think there'll be a similar paradigm shift on the agentic side where, yes, there are protocols, and yes, there is some work that agency is doing, but we will end up seeing maybe hundreds of projects in this space for specific needs, and we'll see maybe hundreds of startups that will crop up because of some of these projects that come about in the next few years.
Yeah, I think the big risk right now, as whether you're a startup or an enterprise, is trying to figure out what building blocks you want to use to deploy agent technology right now, knowing that when you bet on technology, it's an implicit futures contract. Like, is this technology going to be around? Will the community of open source developers, which are largely made up of engineers who work for technology companies, whether it's a startup or a large company, are they going to continue to work on that development, or will some other thing come out of nowhere? And if you had adopted Mesos as an example back when there was sort of this battle between Docker and Mesos and Kubernetes, I think you'd be pretty disappointed today. Because you would inevitably have to re-engineer and shift at great expense all of your technology infrastructure over to Kubernetes. And so that's I think, a difficult call right now. Not to talk our own book, but I think picking software that is in a neutral place, that has a large set of established players who are clearly investing in those projects, is a good leading indicator that that's pretty safe. And we're now really starting to see this IP roll into the Linux Foundation, where companies like Google recently contributed A2A to the Linux Foundation, Cisco contributed agency to the Linux Foundation. Just today, Ray came into the PyTorch Software Foundation, which is a sub-organization at the Linux Foundation. So we're now finally starting to see, okay, the industry is starting to come consensus on what that AI stack is looking like. And I think that will really sort of in the next year or so sort of clear out.
So I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about how the US is investing in open source in AI versus the rest of the world. And I'll start by saying that Jim here speaks fluent Japanese, which you would not guess by just the way he's fluent in English, but he's maybe more fluent in Japanese than he is in English.
そのことない。
And he just recently met the emperor in Japan. So he's a big deal.
Yeah. They told me that if I made a mistake introducing myself to the emperor, that I would have to commit ritual seppuku. So I was very nervous.
But that's not the only reason you end up in Asia. I know you travel quite a bit to Japan as well as China.
Yeah.
China is going pretty big on open source. And
Yeah.
some of us were at TED.ai yesterday.
Okay.
And Kai-Fu Lee was there joining
wow.
remotely.
Oh.
And he was talking about the investment thesis between how venture capitalists invest in China versus here. And he was pointing out that VCs here are after the foundation model game and what you can do with it. Whereas in China, a lot of that VC funding is actually going into robotics. And that's where they are seeing traction. But in terms of open source, we've seen Quen and DeepSeek and the like.
Yeah.
What's your perception in terms of open source adoption, especially today,
Yeah.
between the US and Asia?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in China and have for over 20 years. I think the first time I went to China was in 1991, and it's just incredible to see in one person's lifetime how there's this whole generation in China that's lifted themselves out of poverty and created this sort of juggernaut, which is just really impressive in and of itself. I would say it's not just VC investment differences, but in the US, it's just capital allocation in general, like private equity, public investment and so forth. The number one question that I get asked about China and open source is it's crazy. Where did DeepSeek come from? How did DeepSeek just come out of nowhere? Really small group of kind of quants that created this large language model that was really competitive with the most well-resourced frontier research labs in the world, in OpenAI and Google and so forth. How did that happen is the question. And the answer is it did not come out of nowhere. China has had a decades-long intentional strategy of investing in open source software development. First at the commercial layer where, back in the early 2000s, I would go to China and they would ask me why isn't Linux more popular in China than Windows? And my response was always the same, was because in China, all software is free. And so Linux has no edge because there was just a lot of intellectual property theft at the time. But the Chinese government and industry decided they want to enter the World Trade Organization, and one of the ways to do that was they had to clean up their IP Act. And so they really embraced open source as a way to both comply with intellectual property rules, but also build a domestic software ecosystem. So they started adopting a lot of open source software for operating systems and systems that they needed to run the country and industry there. Then they started to really show up in open source communities. And so you started to see Chinese software developers from Alibaba, Tencent.
I still remember that inflection point in CNCF.
Right.
When we saw the number of contributors.
That's right.
From China just go through the roof.
So they really spent a ton of time and effort intentionally bringing their developers into open source software communities. And I think one of the insights they had is if you look at PyTorch as an example, and you look at the software development over a 10-year period, and you ask yourself, okay, that's a pretty big project, and how many developers would you think wrote half of that software or more? It's 7, 8 people. I mean, in the lifetime of the Linux kernel, how many developers do you think wrote 80% of the code? It's about 120 people, the core Linux software maintainers who are committed for a year. So for a Chinese company, or doesn't matter if you're China or any organization or country, wherever you're from, you get to co-develop software next to these elite 1% developers and learn how they develop software, skills that they learn. It's one of the best free ways to get access to this incredible knowledge and skill, anywhere in the world. And so they did that incredibly well. They just showed up and they started getting in the top ranks of all these open source projects. Then the Chinese government started creating favorable policy towards open source. So one of the things that people don't know a lot about China is they have these 5-year plans, right? If you want to read a great book about this, an author, Dan Wang, this book just came out. It's called Breakneck. And it talks about how the government sets these 5-year plans, and then the provinces, the way you kind of get ahead in China is you compete to do the best against these plans. And there's a lot of waste in that, but there's also a lot of good stuff that comes out of it as well. And one of these things was a pro-open source policy. So you started to see this sort of competition to who can be more open. And the result continues to be to this day just an incredible diffusion of technology across the entire country. You know, oftentimes we think that the Chinese companies are competing with us. They think that they're competing with each other. It's like hyper-competitive in country. And this open source has created this huge diffusion. So then the question is like, they're kind of manipulating the system and taking all this code that comes from the US and bringing it over there, or getting it from somewhere else. But the question then is, well, where did they learn this game that resulted in DeepSeek?
And why aren't we doing it?
But that's the good news.
Yeah.
They learned all of this from us. The original, we were doing open source before they were in China. That's why they were using the open source software that come from the US. It's how IBM was able to compete with an incumbent Microsoft for wallet share using Linux. It's how Google could compete with Amazon by commoditizing cloud infrastructure into software that they understood better to get a competitive edge with Kubernetes, open source and Kubernetes. And I can tell that story over and over and over again across sector, over and over and over again. Cisco did this. Open Daylight was something where you had an insurgent in VMware, which had acquired Nicira, which is a very good, Martin Casado and those guys had created this software-defined networking technology. It was proprietary, and now it's like, whoa, we got this software company over here, and Cisco's competing in networking with them. Well, we'll open source Open Daylight, and now we'll start entering that market. We'll commoditize our competitors, and it's bare knuckle, brass tacks kind of fighting in the corporate arena, but it's a good model. So I think the U.S. is actually in a pretty good position. One, most of the infrastructure tooling that is used in AI does come from US originated development efforts. And two, Llama, is, I'd like to see more, but I think we know the open source game well. And I think it's short-sighted to look at China and say, I don't like what they're doing, and not say hey, we should maybe be doing the same thing.
Yeah, one of the things that at least when we were thinking about agency and the whole Internet of Agents was open source ecosystems they actually drive the maximal value for every participant in the ecosystem, whether you're a vendor, whether you're an operator, whether you're a customer or a developer. Everybody benefits from an open source ecosystem. So talking about the 5-year plans, we need to see a lot more of that from the US. I know you work a lot with the policymakers as well, and you're heading to DC next week. Is that on the agenda, or what's?
I think that you see people in the government who are very pro open source. We're an international organization, and I don't talk a lot of policy, but I think that if you look at the history of the internet, has the United States benefited because most of the protocols and the fundamental Apache web server and the LAMP stack, that all was originated and created by United States technology companies for the most part. There's exceptions, some European companies and a few others, but for the most part. And has that been beneficial to the U.S. economy? I would argue it was. And that open form of competition is a very pure form of competition. I remember talking to an IBM exec once where I said, why are you open sourcing all this stuff? What is it? Aren't you enabling your competitors? Well, I hear this all the time. We're just going to be enabling our competitors. And what they said was, what? If we're going to create a new market, if we're going to open source this technology in order to accelerate the adoption and growth of a particular sector, a form of computing, software-defined network, container deployment, or whatever it is, and we know that tech better than anybody else, 6-month advantage in time to market and value capture, kind of all we need. That's how fast the industry moves. And I think the important part for entrepreneurs and companies is to be clear where the open source winds are blowing, so that they can come up with very creative ways to capture value on top of that or adjacent to those huge technology trends. The Linux Foundation in many ways is a co-development organization and a market maker of container-based cloud deployment or software-defined networking. Value capture is not in our job description, but I have total faith in the venture community here in Silicon Valley and private equity investors that are very, very efficient at allocating capital to capture value in the market.
So that leads me to the next one, which is, and you and I talk about this quite a bit, which is the Linux Foundation is an open source ecosystem foundation. You would think that managing the technology curve or managing projects is the thing you do. But I've heard you say this time and again. It's about managing people. It's about managing egos and company cultures. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
I think the secret to an organization, if I had to like redact down, I don't know if people know this about the Linux Foundation, but we have a very large portfolio of technology. RISC-V, fastest growing free semiconductor instruction set in the world, is a Linux Foundation project. Node.js, kind of a backbone of front-end, application development, Linux Foundation project. React just became a part of the Linux Foundation, the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, PyTorch, and I could keep going on and on and on. We have a partnership with the Motion Picture Academy, the Academy Software Foundation, where all of the film and CGI tooling to create movies in Hollywood is entirely open source. And people ask me, like, what do you actually do? My wife, who was disappointed 20 years ago, just this morning was at the PyTorch guys asking the same question. She doesn't know what I do. It's very disturbing. But I think the simplest way to think about it is we're almost like a reverse venture capital firm that has a portfolio of technology. And when you're looking at technology, we sort of ask ourselves three questions similar to what an investor would ask. One, is this technology going to move the needle on industry or society? Is the TAM big enough? Will this actually be worth our time? If it's just some small project, we probably wouldn't even get involved. And that is both an art and a science. Trying to figure out what the right cloud abstraction layer was in the days where there were virtual machines and then there was PaaS, like Heroku, Cloud Foundry. It's like, is PaaS going to be a thing? Well, maybe it's super scripted, not sure. Well, maybe it's going to be Mesos, maybe it's going to be Docker, maybe it's going to be Kubernetes. What's it going to be? That is actually very difficult to do. It requires both understanding the technology and some intuition about how the industry works from a business perspective. And so getting ahead of that and being able to invest in interesting new impactful technology is really important. But unlike a venture capitalist where you're doing that for the sake of value capture, we're doing that for the sake of value sharing. We want to give that all the way for free. So is this going to move the needle is our first question. The second question is, do you need more than one organization to do it? Is this stuff pre-competitive? Like if we're just going to be flacking, like if A2A was just going to be controlled by Google and they owned the commit bid and the A2A trademark and all of the GitHub repository and every part of that infrastructure, we just wouldn't do it. The question is like, if Google wants to go partner on A2A with a big group of other industry stakeholders, we add value because we own the intellectual property.
I can speak to that because I think on the A2A side, we are foundational members.
Yep.
On the agency side, they are formative members as well. And we are actually contributing code to each other's projects. And it's actually a community project which is driven neutrally by the LF. So the LF is actually great at building communities and fostering this collaboration.
Because at the core, we own the intellectual property. So you have a guarantee the license isn't going to change. You have a guarantee that your competitor is not going to not allow you to commit code to a project that you depend on for your products. And that's a big deal. Like no one's going to invest, $100 million in engineering time into a competitor's code base that they own. If it's neutrally owned, then you're off to the code development races. And so is this going to move the needle? Do you need more than one organization? And the final thing is it does take resources to facilitate large-scale code development and to promote and make markets in tech. And so we have roughly 380 employees at the Linux Foundation. This year, our collective annual operating budget across like all of our different entities and projects is going to be roughly $350 million in collective investment. And that investment goes into hosting repositories, to release management, to security audits, to promoting the technologies, to growing the developer community. So there's a cost to it as well. Most of the investment in open source projects that we host is not in the form of money that's used to facilitate the development. It's in paying the engineers, of which I think there's roughly 1 million a day who work on our projects every day. I mean, that's a pretty big payroll. You know, it's like a multi-billion-dollar payroll. That's where most of the actual open source investment goes, but we need to have some resources to facilitate that co-development.
And I think that is super important because there are other open source organizations out there, but the way the LF uses those funds to actually nurture the community and grow that community is the reason why open source works in the first place. So I think that is a very much needed way of operating an open source ecosystem.
Yeah, I think, you know, Linus Torvalds, who I know can get a bad rap for being a little prickly on the Linux kernel mailing list, is actually a really pleasant guy and truly cares about his craft and wants Linux to be this impactful, important thing. And that culture permeates itself throughout the entire company. We sort of have this motto, helpful, humble, hopeful, because, you know, if you're not hopeful, just trying to bet on next generation technology and these big goals is very, very difficult to do. If you're not helpful, it just kind of doesn't happen, right? We got to add some kind of value. But I think it's the humility part where we get to be a part of these huge trends that matters. Like, I tell every person I work with, if you cannot sublimate your ego, you will fail at the Linux Foundation, because it turns out, rumor has it, that open source developers and elite software developers have big egos as well, and strong opinions, and you know, you have to kind of let those egos work together harmoniously.
There are so many stories here, Jim.
You have to be humble to facilitate that, and so I think that is an important skill that, you know, we do, and that's kind of part of that people management and part of market making and part of, I think people don't realize that most of my time is not spent promoting or talking about a project that's already public and that the Linux Foundation, like PyTorch, you know, like I'm not even on stage over there. I have another leader who runs that project and a whole team that works on it. I'm working behind the scenes on the next big open source project, and a lot of my work is building consensus between a lot of organizations who are going to invest a huge amount of resources into this technology, and sort of leverage the organic innovation that happens naturally in open source with the very big resources that can come out of a large technology investment. That is really where I've spent almost all of my time, and try to balance the, you know, top-down investment approach with the bottoms-up organic innovation that open source is so good at. That's a tricky job.
So we'll open it up to questions, but before we do, just one last thing here where so I'm pretty finicky about wine. Mm-hmm. He's 10x more finicky about wine.
True.
And so the question here is, let's say open source powers AGI, whatever your definition of AGI might be. So maybe it's in 5 years.
Okay.
Which bottle do you think we are opening here when that happens?
All right. Well, 1995 Clos d'Itar.
That was quick.
All right. I like Burgundy. I'm a Burgundy guy. But I mean, I think bringing up like, will open source power be a tool to break through to AGI? I'm not a super big AGI guy, to be honest. Like, you know, but I am a big person that even if frontier model development stopped now and just like agentic tooling kind of caught up, that it will change all of our lives in a humongous way. It already is. And that idea that intelligence is something where the technology creating that intelligence is in the hands of many is deeply important. I think to society, it's definitely important to me. I think it's important to industry. I think it's important to startups. that technology be open and widely held as we take that journey. Now, there's a counter argument that, hey, this technology can be kind of scary. And there's sort of vague, like, oh, that's super intelligence will sort of, you can't have this in the hands of the many because it's going to be too dangerous. I just think it's kind of vague and unclear to me that that's the case. But I think if you had to make a choice, one, I think there are immediate and urgent issues with AI safety where, oddly, the answer to problems created by tech can be more tech. Non-consensual sexual imagery, we need to have better ways to find it. Content provenance and deep fakes. We have a project called C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is digital watermarking technology that is in almost every modern new camera. It's in recording systems and can be embedded throughout the content creation value chain so that when you see the C2PA mark, that that that's authentic. I think that's going to be important for messages from government leaders and leaders around the world so that we know what's true or not. But in terms of like broadly scary AGI things, I would take that technology being held widely versus held narrowly.
Thank you, Jim, and let's go for questions.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could address the sustainability side and the bottlenecks of electricity, water, and compute. So I have my WSET 3. AI consumes about 5 times as much alcohol as we do in the world, so if I compare it to water. What do you guys think about water from a sustainability perspective and how we're going to address that?
By how quickly I answered the wine question, I don't know, 5x alcohol consumption, I'm probably a hypocrite on this one. That's a very difficult problem that I think one of the things from the Linux Foundation's perspective that we try to do, and I think that Linus, I think, says this the best, people always ask him what his vision for Linux is. He says, I'm not looking up in the sky with some grand vision. I've got my head down, looking in front of me, taking a couple steps at a time. And it's a sort of form of pragmatism about, okay, this is clearly an issue. What could an organization like ours do to impact that issue? And so, again, I think the answer is, and it may solve itself because at a certain point it just becomes so cost prohibitive that maybe non-deterministic systems aren't that good after all. Maybe the deterministic system was cheaper in the first place and got the job done just as well. I think that's something people should understand, very, very important. But Deep Speed is a project that we're working on and is in the PyTorch Software Foundation that just helps to make these training and inference systems more power efficient. I do think there's a lot, and there's tons of research papers on this. I think the Chinese frontier model developers, they're publishing their research. It's incredible. They're just so open about publishing their research about how they're getting breakthroughs in power consumption and other parts of the frontier model development. I think those things will start to solve some of these problems. I don't have deep understanding into what the unit economics of some of these frontier model providers are in terms of are they relying more on inference to get better answers and outcomes in their models or not? And is that disproportionately, costing more money than value that they can capture? I just that's not I'm the nonprofit guy, so that's not my thing. But I think that's something that will over time kind of clear out in the financial system. But I think at least for now, what we focus on is what are technologies that we can co-develop with the industry to reduce the cost of these large data centers and more competition. Certainly there's, I'm going to be at an event with someone who wears a similar jacket to you next week. Certainly there's some market concentration that you'll see competition help reduce costs, make power consumption better. So at the LF, we take a pretty pragmatic approach on this. What can we build to help with this, as opposed to how do we solve the whole problem?
So you mentioned a lot of hits, PyTorch, Kubernetes, and all that. I'm just curious, is there a list of misses as well, like big misses?
Oh, yes.
And why? Why did that happen?
We don't talk about those.
Yeah, that's what.
Old soldiers never die. They just slowly fade away. There have been some misses, and I'll tell you there were two big ones for me. One, the Linux Foundation tends to be on the front end of big technology cycles. And so, in the last 20 years, mobile computing, cloud computing, now AI were like these huge mega cycles of tech. I guess I would throw software-defined networking, things like that, virtualization of hardware infrastructure into that as well. And in mobile, we tried to and hosted some mobile operating system efforts. I think the first one was named MIMO, and that was like a consortium, Nokia and Samsung and some other players. Then it became MeeGo, and that was like Intel and Nokia and others, where we were trying to create a mobile ecosystem. And I remember at a certain point, Apple was so far ahead at Android, which was also open source, but wholly owned and controlled by Google, had gotten such momentum and had so much investment that it really became this mobile duopoly at that point, and every open source thing that we were working on, MeeGo in particular, kind of got knocked out. Fun fact, MeeGo is still used as a operating system for all Samsung televisions, their watches, and is still out there. So it's still a project that there is developer activity on, but I wouldn't consider that a home run. You're using an Android device, not a MeeGo device at this point. The second one is a project called AllSeen. I don't know if you remember this one. AllSeen, and then it became AllJoin. So this was an IoT effort that was supposed to solve the problem of IoT connectivity, particularly home connectivity. So it was going to be a modern Zigbee, modern, sort of way to get your home devices to work with each other. Does anybody here use like home IoT systems for your thermostat and your garage door or whatever? Does it all work completely seamlessly, and is it super easy to onboard new devices? Yeah, it all sucks. It's just terrible. So we were working on this like 15 years ago. Total failure. I just don't think the market was ready. I think there was big competition between Google, Amazon, and Apple to sort of have HomeKit and the Ring ecosystem and the Nest ecosystem all compete with each other, and we never did it. And the result is what you're all experiencing today, which is like, God, I can never hook this thing up to talk to the other thing. And so that was kind of depressing. Matter is a technology that's also an open technology that I think is finally getting us there, but that is not a Linux Foundation project, but you can't have them all. So we missed out on that one.
Maybe one more question if we have time. Going once, going twice. All right.
Thank you, Jim. This was a pleasure to talk to you.
All right.
And
Thank you.